Apologies for not getting this wide receiver rankings out earlier. I will be posting my 2025 first big board this upcoming week. If you look into this YouTube feed, you will also find some new videos from this week's of shows. This wide receiver ranking is not from this week of shows. This wide receiver ranking at this point is about 3 weeks old or so, but this is my first ranking recorded after week 5 of the college football season. And so not a whole lot has changed, but if you want to listen to the most updated rankings and changes, you'll have to subscribe to the Fantasy for Real podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or wait for that video to come out to this channel a bit later next week. But with that said, let's get into some wide receiver rankings. Before we get started on the player-specific notes when it comes to the 2025 wide receiver class, I wanted to go over a few criteria about the position itself. So first thing, we have size and age for each prospect on this list, but I might not go over all of them, but I will go over details that are important, and at least in my opinion, to the archetypes of each player, and most players will at least probably have their size mentioned, because it is just important in how we envision the wide receivers. And as always, I don't know if I actually specifically mentioned this on the last show, though anyone who listens to this show should know that every single age I ever give out on this show is rounded to September 1st. For professional athletes, it is rounded to September 1st of the current year. For prospects, it is rounded to September 1st of the year they're going to be in the NFL draft. So, for example, if you hear an age on this show that is, say, roughly 10 months older than what a prospect is, that is because it is the age that they will be on September 1st of next year. So, whereas the running back position is the most traits-driven position in terms of wanting guys to basically look like Nicholas Singleton if we had our choice of ideals, the wide receiver position is the most production-focused position in all of fantasy sports, the one where we should care the most about on-field performance, as well as specific adjustments on-field performance, like the proportion of your offense's statistics and how young you were when you broke out. These things are not obviously perfect, and they all come with the asterisk that we have to understand that players have to have requisite traits for the NFL level, regardless of the production they have. But the more and more that I have been paying attention to fantasy sports, when we have bigger, faster, stronger wide receivers, a lot of times people say higher upside. But what I've come to understand, at least in my own observations, is that what actually gives us indications of upside is not physicality. In fact, what physicality gives us more often is an indication of floor. Taller, bigger, stronger, faster wide receivers are more likely to get on a field consistently from the beginning than a smaller, less well-built wide receiver who might not have the most speed. But when it comes to the upper tier wide receivers in the sport, they come from all kinds of different sizes, archetypes, and so they obviously need to have some kind of trait because they need to win in some way. Wide receiver, a lot of time, just comes down to how you win and the ways you can win. And so obviously you need traits that can win against NFL corners. So it's not like there has nothing to do with physicality, but this position is about the physicality, the traits, but also the production. The production can get us a long way with wide receiver. And as much as we use numbers on this show, I would never suggest that at any position you go by just numbers. But if there was one position where you wanted to take draft capital and then combine it with numbers, towards at running back, I would probably just say just go by draft capital. But if there was one position you wanted to take draft capital and combine it with numbers and just say, I'm good, the position you can probably do that the best with is the wide receiver position. Now, we obviously don't have the draft capital. We won't have that for a very long time. But these are just my observations about where this class stands right now. And then one final note about wide receivers and how we analyze them specifically in terms of position. I mentioned this a few shows ago, and I think I'm going more and more into this in terms of just the way I'm making out my own notes, which is when it comes to wide receivers. Obviously, outside wide receivers are their own thing. If you're an outside wide receiver, you're an outside wide receiver. We can just kind of move on. But there are some deficits. I mean, there's some positives too, but there are some deficits that come with playing in the slot. And when it comes to fantasy production, we have seen players produce from the slot. But I think when it comes to profiling, we should prefer players who can play both inside and outside. So when it comes to non-outside players, or at least not solely outside players, players that will be outside most of the time, I have started to lean on 3 specific distinctions. Inside-outside, which is the one we want, the versatile role, inside-outside versatile. And then slot heavy, which is still probably okay. But there are some questions, especially, you want to go, for example, to a team that plays a lot of 11 personnel. And then the one that's actually concerning, which not many people on this list, to be fair today, are going to have this this label because players on this list are at least very close to a day 2 grade for me. But the concerning label is slot only. When we're dealing with very small wide receivers who might not have the most explosive ability, and specifically if they play in the slot a lot, the concern there is that they will be slot only. But with all that said, it is time to get into the specific players. So it is pretty common at this point to have Tetairoa McMillan as the number 1 wide receiver on the list, and he is the number 1 wide receiver on my list at this point. I have been going back and forth between whether to actually put him above Luther Burden. I think there are some things when it comes to the explosive play ability with Luther Burden that feel to me in the modern game a little bit safer. To be frank, like they're both playing at a high level, but we're kind of seeing this dynamic. I don't think these two players are quite the same level of prospects, even though they're top 2 in this class. But I think we're seeing this dynamic play out right away with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors at the next level. And again, it's unfair to make the 1-to-1 distinction, but for all the things that people have said about, Malik Neighbors not being refined in this way or doing this specific thing, it is very clear already that Malik Neighbors is so explosive and such an amazing playmaker at the next level that those specific things don't really matter. A lot of those things that Marvin Harrison Jr. is better at, they do help us get a sense of his floor. And again, these aren't comparable prospects, but they do give us a sense of his floor. But in this modern game where a lot of coaches are good at getting playmakers into space, just being the playmaker might be actually the higher floor situation. But for Tetairoa McMillan, he has a unique combination of not just the size and the length that allows him to make crazy catches and have a giant catch radius, but he is showing these things like breaking tackles, which are kind of rare abilities for a big wide receiver that relate to kind of Drake London in college and Nico Collins at the NFL level. Nico Collins is kind of like an odd comparison to use because it's a very early comparison because he is just kind of becoming a player that you would want to compare someone to. But he's actually the player that kind of fits the most to me. Like Tetairoa McMillan is kind of a more narrow version of that. But they're both explosive players who have great size, great length, great catchability, both in the reliability of their hands and the contested catchability within their hands. But on top of all of that, if they just had that, they might be a decent X receiver at the next level. But on top of that, they are dynamic playmakers. They might not be explosive dynamic playmakers in the same way as a Luther Burden or at a higher level of Malik Neighbors, but he is an explosive playmaker because he's able to make great plays with the ball in his hands. And then you can maybe say something about the surface numbers this year being a little bit up and down when it comes to the receiving and the reception itself, and that might be a little fair. But at this point, we've pretty much already checked every box we really need to check with Tetairoa McMillan in the sense that, this is a guy who led all true freshmen in receiving yards in his first year. He also led all true sophomores in true sophomore receiving yards his second year. So Tetairoa McMillan, he has already done all these things in terms of the production, in terms of the youth production, in terms of the proportion of production on his team, that he should be an elite analytical prospect. Consider that he is an elite analytical prospect and had elite prospect grades coming into college, it seems also fair to project Tetairoa McMillan to be a top 10 NFL draft pick. So again, maybe that's way too early buzz, and so far on the show, I have listed Tetairoa McMillan more often as my wide receiver 2 than my wide receiver 1, but these are both more 1A and 1B in terms of two players that have the exact same really top 10 grade at the NFL level. Going to the second one now, Luther Burden. Now, I mentioned how Tetairoa McMillan was a high-level high school recruit, but he had nothing on Luther Burden, who was the number 1 wide receiver of his class and one of the big-time names of his high school recruitment class. Now, unlike Tetairoa McMillan, who is listed at 6'5", I don't know if I actually mentioned that, Luther Burden is listed at 5'11", 205 pounds. On top of being 5'11", he does play primarily out of the slot. That isn't necessarily something that concerns us individually, but it is the fact that he plays a bit more of this playmaker role than the refined wide receiver role that we kind of usually feel floor with, that will cause some people to not like Luther Burden as much as maybe the market. But Luther Burden, the reason we talk at the beginning of this section about wide receiver wins is that wide receivers can win in all kinds of different ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they all will translate to the next level, but I believe that the ways Luther Burden wins can translate to the next level. And what he did last year was 86 receptions, 1,212 yards, and 9 touchdowns in the SEC. I mentioned on the previous show how I remove FCS games because it says a lot about how a coach likes to load manage their players. And I think ultimately that Luther Burden is the greatest example of why. We're going to get into a lot of changing dynamics with the new college football playoff, and teams like Missouri, who used to have a special, like truly special season for their team to make the college football playoff, a season where they surprisingly go like 11-1 and make the SEC championship. Instead of that, they're only going to need to play to a top 12 level, with about 5 of those byes going to conference champions. I believe it's 5 or 6, but regardless, you're going to have 6, 7 at-large bids, and you only have to be one of them. So we're already seeing consistently from Missouri the idea that they have an intention to load manage their best players in some of these games. I'm not saying it is all load management, but Luther Burden on the season, despite the numbers that on the surface don't look that strong, has a 2.65 yards per out run. 2.65, that's lower than some of the numbers we're going to hear today because some of these players are over 3, but 2.65 is very healthy, especially for a player that already has a full productive season. So Missouri's had a softer schedule so far this year, but that is going to change. I mean, it's not the hardest SEC schedule in general, but they do have A&M next week. They do have at Alabama coming up a few weeks down the line. They have Oklahoma this season. They have South Carolina, Arkansas, Auburn. When you're coming to SEC schedules, what really makes a soft schedule at this point is avoiding 2 of the 3 when it comes to Alabama, Georgia, and Texas, and they do avoid Georgia and Texas. But that kind of goes even more to the reason that you would load manage with a slightly easier schedule without another one of those losses. You need to make sure that you are ready to make sure you can beat A&M, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Arkansas, and Auburn. If you can especially beat all those teams, even if you get beat up pretty decent by Alabama, even if you make the SEC championship and get beat up pretty decently, you have a decent chance of being one of the at-larges. So I'll get into this a little bit later too with Evan Stewart and a comparison to Evan Stewart, but I do believe load management is a major reason why Luther Burden is not producing so far this year. The per route stats still look good. The missed tackle force stats per reception still look good, and he is still an explosive player. The more concerning thing would probably be in some of the specific areas of refinement that we often look for, as well as the fact that he often plays out of the slot. So the next wide receiver I have here, and he's not really a wide receiver, but it is Travis Hunter, obviously, with that statement, the cornerback from Colorado. And Travis Hunter, obviously another player who is an early declare. The last 2 players, early declares as well, young wide receivers. Travis Hunter listed at 6'1", 185 pounds, so a little bit light there. But Travis Hunter is obviously, the main question is one that we're not going to be able to answer no matter how long we go on about it on this show, which is he going to play cornerback? Is he going to play wide receiver? Or is he going to try to play both? And when you consider his stamina alone with what he does at the college football level, you have to consider it's at least possible that at least one team will try it. But regardless of that, let's just set aside the conversation about that right now, other than to say that what he is doing is even more impressive because of the fact that he is a full-time defensive player. But on the season in 5 games, Travis Hunter has 46 receptions, 561 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I do usually prefer to look at the FBS stats, though to be fair, North Dakota State is kind of a powerhouse and institution of the FCS. But to be fair to everybody, against the FBS, Travis Hunter is a little bit worse in the touchdown department, but overall still 39 receptions, 429 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So that's about, 107 receiving yards a game against the FBS, and for the first time this last weekend, he was under 100 yards, though he still had a very good game. In the last 13 games, including the game against North Dakota State, but removing the game that he left in the first half due to injury, Travis Hunter in 13 games, again, playing as a full-time defensive player, has 106 receptions, 1,261 yards, and 11 touchdowns. So I think I said this on the Risers last week, but there was a point in time where I was wondering how we would evaluate Travis Hunter based on, efficiency because of the fact that he would be a part-time player. At this point, it's pretty clear when he has better production than most of this class that we don't have to do that. Oh, sure, we can be more impressed by the fact that it exists, but there's really no, if in 13 games he is putting up 1,261 yards and 100 receptions and double-digit touchdowns, we don't have to have any kind of conversation about how to adjust his numbers to make them look okay. They're already phenomenal. So if Travis Hunter, just because of the raw talent of the individual, he might not be the best wide receiver prospect. But I honestly believe this might be me being a bit, something about it. But if Travis Hunter said, I am never playing cornerback again, he's probably my number 1 player in this class. Maybe that's an overreaction, and I don't play IDP, so I have no idea how to react or adjust him for that format. But Travis Hunter in my tier 1 of wide receiver because he is so spectacular even if he doesn't ultimately play the position. So we're getting into my tier 2 now, and the first player on this list for tier 2 is Emeka Egbuka, the wide receiver from Ohio State. Now, Emeka Egbuka is the first player on this list who is a 4th year player, but it's important to remember that as much as we talk about early declares, and I just talked a lot about how early declares are important to me at this position specifically, we have at least one top tier wide receiver in each of the last few classes that was not an early declare. In the last class, we had Rome Odunze, who was roughly in the same tier as the top two, usually in the 3rd position, but fairly close to the top 2 wide receivers. Before that, we had Zay Flowers, who went a little bit later in the draft, but was about in the same place as the number 1 wide receiver in that class. And then the year before that, we had Chris Olave, who went about, I believe, the 11th pick of the draft. And then I believe Jahan Dotson, Xavier Legette, Ricky Pearsall, these aren't the only 2 seniors in the last few years, but we've had at least one highly drafted player in the senior class in the last few years. And if you're asking me to bet on who it will be for this class, it would be Emeka Egbuka. So Emeka Egbuka is 6'1", 205 pounds, and he's a little bit older for even the senior designation. He is 22 years, 10 months as of September 1st. So he is under 23. So it's not like he's too old, but a lot of times 4th year players will be really in the middle of that 22. He is a lot closer to 23. But it's important to note that, the one thing I hear about Emeka Egbuka that I disagree with the most kind of goes back to that opening thing I talked about with size. I hear a lot of people say that Emeka Egbuka is ranked where he is because of where he was last year, and when it comes to a little bit later down the line, he might fall down because of his ceiling and upside. But to me, I don't question the ceiling and the upside because to me, what showcases your ceiling and upside is your ability to play at the highest level with high level efficiency. Obviously, that's not a perfect set for everybody, but with 74 receptions, 1151, and 10 touchdowns in his second year, alongside Marvin Harrison Jr., who had very similar statistics, Emeka Egbuka showed by year 2 that he could be an elite player at the highest level of college football. He even had a 3 yards per route run on that season, and so even though he dealt with injury and missed a lot of the 2023 season, you have to feel pretty good about the fact that this guy has always been a really good wide receiver, and we can even see that as well by the yards per route run. In his career, by season, Emeka Egbuka as a freshman had a 3.29 yards per route run, as a sophomore 3.01, then as a junior, the injured season, it was 2.01, and then his final year so far, it is 4.11. So in every season of his career where he hasn't had substantial injuries, obviously this is only a partial season so far, but in every season of his career where he has not had substantial injuries, Emeka Egbuka has had a yards per route run above 3. So, he might not look like DK Metcalf, but players like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I think you could also kind of compare Emeka Egbuka to, they have a lot of upside, obviously. He is one of the highest ranked players in Dynasty football. And I think Emeka Egbuka, I don't question the upside. So Emeka Egbuka is a player that I like quite a bit. I don't know if he's going to move off this spot, frankly. Because there are a couple players, and we'll get to them pretty much right here, that are close to Emeka Egbuka, might even get drafted higher. But unless they're drafted much higher or take a substantial step forward this year, none of them have done anywhere close to what Emeka Egbuka did by his second year. And a lot of these players coming up are obviously in their 3rd year, because they're eligible for the draft. So, we didn't talk about the specifics for the schedule this time around with Ohio State we did last time, but they do have Iowa, they do have Oregon, they do have Nebraska, they do have Penn State, they do have Michigan. If you want to throw Indiana in there too because they're now ranked, I would like that. I would prefer that as a Hoosier myself, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that they will have games to test themselves. They just haven't had them yet. But next up is my favorite player in this class that doesn't necessarily have the production yet. Because when you look at the first 4 players, and I'm throwing Hunter in there because he does have the production, so we don't have to make an aside, all these players have at least one incredibly elite season, right? Tetairoa McMillan and Luther Burden were 2 of the most elite wide receivers for the entire season last year. Emeka Egbuka did it in his sophomore year, 2022. Travis Hunter, it's not like one single season yet because we're taking parts of 2023 and 2024 and putting them together because he missed time with injury. But none of these players can even do that. None of these players can pick and choose their 12 favorite games of their career and get to the point that Travis Hunter is. These guys are extremely productive. One player that is not productive yet, but is showing some signs that he is taking a step forward in that area is Isaiah Bond, the wide receiver from Texas, the transfer from Alabama. So Isaiah Bond, 5'11", 180 pounds, and he slotted right in as the replacement for Xavier Worthy. He's also a very young wide receiver at 21 years, 6 months, but getting back to that Xavier Worthy comparison, Isaiah Bond is obviously not going to be as fast as Xavier Worthy. I say obviously, anything is possible, but usually when you're the fastest man at the NFL Combine, we don't expect someone to be faster. But what Isaiah Bond lacks in speed compared to Xavier Worthy, because it's weird to say he lacks in speed, because he doesn't lack in speed at all, just specifically maybe compared to Xavier Worthy, he more than makes up for it in getting rid of some of the red flag areas by being a more normally sized wide receiver and being a little bit better in some of the difficult contested situations. So obviously Worthy had a good game this week. He had a good game in week 1, and so he has shown some nice things already at the NFL level. But to me, I've always been questioning with Worthy. I always prefer a prospect that has good and great and maybe some things that aren't quite as good to a player who has a lot more great but also has a lot of red flags. And that's kind of the difference to me between Bond and Worthy. Bond doesn't have as much great in his profile yet, but I don't actually see a red flag in at least my personal subjective opinion looking over the profile. But Worthy, I did have multiple red flags because they were both in the physical size that he had as well as the way he played at the catch point. So for me, this is kind of, if you didn't follow the show last year, if you didn't follow the rankings up into the draft, this might sound like a more significant statement than it is, because Worthy to me was a little bit lower than he was in the NFL, maybe more like a fringe top 50 pick. But to me, Isaiah Bond is the player between the two I would probably list higher already for the NFL game. That is a little bit of a projection, but so far this season, he is showing a lot more. He has 20 receptions, 364 yards, and 3 touchdowns already with 2 carries, 51 yards, and a touchdown. And he has shown at the biggest moments for his team. He was the player who caught the touchdown in the back of the end zone for the Auburn Miracle to take down Auburn for Alabama. And without that game, they don't even get into the playoffs, so they miss out on a lot of the accomplishments they had last season. So I know those things come off as very anecdotal, but I say them because for players that are in situations where they don't have as good and clear as an opportunity to get proportions, it's important to look at times and points where they were special or spectacular. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can do that more consistently, but it goes back to what we talked about on the last show when we first got into these 2025 rankings, that we really do need to judge players to an extent on their capacity. Isaiah Bond is showing a little bit more and more that he can live up to that capacity in this season. Now, on the opposite side of things, the player who is struggling to show that they can live up to their capacity, an issue that has been an issue with them for pretty much their entire career, is Evan Stewart. So Evan Stewart is a wide receiver from Oregon, transferred from Texas A&M, and it's important to note that at this point, Evan Stewart used to be with Emeka, Egbuka, and Isaiah Bond, but we are transitioning now from the 2A tier to the 2B tier, where Evan Stewart has now dropped down a half tier for me. We always have our own perspectives, and for me, the perspective, and I'm not trying to drag anybody else, especially just specifically on Evan Stewart, we all have hits and misses, but the resources that I listen to the most that are outside myself, like say Campus to Canton, those resources have been very high on Evan Stewart, and so my perspective of myself has always been kind of staying a little bit lower than that on Evan Stewart. But we are starting to get to the point where I will release a ranking or something where Evan Stewart is ranked in a certain place, and I get reactions like, why are you still ranking him there? And at this point, I think it is pretty fair to ask that question. Now, the tier I have him in, I'll just spoil it and go ahead. It is Antonio Williams and Elic Ayomanor. Now, Ayomanor is a bit of a different situation. He does have the proportional stats we really look for as a peak wide receiver, but they have come in a tumultuous Stanford situation. But none of these players have really had at least a singular elite season that we're really looking for. But Evan Stewart, I think what I'm trying to get at is Evan Stewart is a guy that a lot of people like because of his potential and because he lines up with a couple specific archetypal separation things that we're really looking for in the NFL modern game. And I think we can really focus on those. And I think there's a fair reason to believe that when we get to the NFL, when we get to that point, he will start rising again because of teams that look at this capacity in a vacuum. But there was even an amount of wiggle room that I would have afforded Evan Stewart in this situation, by which I just mean Tez Johnson is a good wide receiver. Tez Johnson I won't talk about much on this show because I think he's a little bit more of a yak guy, maybe more of an honorable mention type. But for the college game, Evan Stewart being behind Tez Johnson for this team that Tez Johnson's been on for a year longer, that wasn't super surprising. But there's enough room in this offense for Tez Johnson to have the game he had this past weekend and for Evan Stewart to do more than 3 receptions for 9 yards. And this is getting into I kind of mentioned that I bring up Luther Burden's numbers again, but Luther Burden's routes, I think, really spell this kind of difference between him and Evan Stewart. Evan Stewart has run 38 routes in 2 games this season where he came, and exactly 38 routes, where he came away with 9 yards and 15 yards in those 2 games. Evan Stewart has ran 124 routes. He has 162 yards. That is 1.31 yards per route run. So the comparison I'm talking about here with Luther Burden, Evan Stewart has ran 27 more routes than Luther Burden. 27 more routes. Luther Burden has 94 more yards. So Evan Stewart has ran 27 more routes and has almost 100 fewer yards. For the exact numbers, Burden has 257 yards and 97 routes. That is why he's at about 2.5. And Evan Stewart has 162 yards again in those 124 routes. So Luther Burden has this specific load management argument. Maybe you can argue that they're load managing Evan Stewart in some way by not using him, but that doesn't really make sense when they're putting him on the field in darn near every snap. So when this guy's playing darn near every snap in a game multiple times this year and coming away with 15 yards or fewer twice, then he has one good game on the season, 100 yards against Boise State, which that was a close game, but it was only 100 yards. Evan Stewart is going to be a player that starts to fall rapidly if it doesn't turn around. He's already fallen a half tier for me, and he's already questionably not the player I would probably buy from this tier. Like, I have Elic Ayomanor in a league. I've been trying to acquire Antwane Williams in a league, and I would be buying those players still. I would not be buying Evan Stewart right now. As much as you could buy him low right now, I don't know if I'd be willing to do that right now unless I had an absolute panicked manager. And I will say just one more thing on this. I think Evan Stewart is a nice prototype for, and maybe he doesn't live up to this. I think it's like a little unfair, I guess, to put it on a player. But a lot of times I think why production is so important at the wide receiver position more than any other position is that you need to generate those targets. And the reason that you're not being consistent, the reason that you're not doing the things that you need to do to get your coach and quarterback to throw you the ball, whether we can see those or not, those sometimes are the things that relate to you at the next level. And so I'm not necessarily saying that there's anything super specific, though I will say that like Quinshon Judkins, Evan Stewart did have a tumultuous exit from Texas A&M, where Texas A&M people do not say the nicest things. But we're not even talking about that too much. It's just the fact that when a player isn't productive, whether we can see or cannot see the reasons, I think sometimes it's important to just say, maybe there is a reason, whether we see it or not. And while I know a lot of people in the Devy community will see if Evan Stewart slips farther than this as a buying opportunity, I guess all I'll ultimately say is if you buy into Evan Stewart as a buying opportunity and 4 years from now he's never productive, you just need to make sure that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you tell yourself, we should have expected this. We can't say, I really like the tape, I really like the traits, I couldn't have possibly expected this. We should be saying to ourselves, why did we expect anything else? We've watched him for 3 years and he hasn't been productive. So that can change really quick for Evan Stewart. Maybe it does change really quickly for Evan Stewart, but coming off of another game this past weekend where he had 38 routes, 9 yards, and Tez Johnson lit it up, it is getting to the point where we don't have any real reason to expect anything better this year. So I did just mention who the next 2 wide receivers would be. The 2 wide receivers that share this tier with Evan Stewart might be a little bit higher on my list right now because I am probably more willing to go out and buy them in a Devy league. But the first one here is Antwane Williams, 5'11", 190 pounds, and notably not only an early declare, but one of the youngest players on this list at 21 years and 2 months as of September 1st. So to put that into another perspective, that means that Antwane Williams turned 20 years old just before this season started. Antwane Williams, like Emeka Egbuka, and I didn't really talk about this with Emeka Egbuka, but they are the type of players that I really profile into that inside-outside versatile role that we talked about at the beginning. Yes, I think they will play a lot out of the slot, but I don't think they're necessarily slot only, and I don't necessarily think they're slot heavy either. I do think that they can play in a very versatile role that just largely involves the slot. Now, I thought Antwane Williams looked really good against Georgia, and I thought he made some really good plays down the field against NC State as well, but the numbers haven't been there, especially when we're seeing Cade Klubnik break out. And even if you're not with me on the Cade Klubnik breakout, the numbers are good enough that 16 for 196 and 3 touchdowns is not quite enough for what we're looking for. And the real concern that I would have for Antonio Williams in this regard is the fact that the two guys next to Antonio Williams in TJ Moore and Bryant Wesco, they're both freshmen. So it says probably more about them and their explosive ability, especially like the Bryant Wesco explosive ability that they've been trying to get into action for Clemson. But the freshman involvement is a little bit concerning because this is a season where with those two freshmen, I would have hoped to see this be kind of all Antonio Williams with next year being their year to shine. I mean, they can't even enter the draft until 2027. So there is a little bit of a concern there, and a lot of people who really just watch the numbers, because we talked about production at the beginning of the show, but it's not just the numbers for this show, especially because early production and proportions matter. But some people are going to see some of these players who have been putting up like 400 yards in a game, and they're going to be saying like, why are we putting Antonio Williams over him still? And to be fair, they might have a point. But I see an inside-outside versatile wide receiver who is still extremely young, produced as a freshman, and has played well this year and missed most of 2023 for injury. So I do feel like I'm a little bit out on an island on Antonio Williams at this point, because while it was a bit more consensus after his freshman year, it seems like a lot of people, when they get into doing scouting, they really look at the past season and the past season's tape, and Antonio Williams like didn't have any because he was injured for most of the year. And so that is a fair reason to not have him ranked very highly, but still, I think he has the talent to be ranked very highly at his age, in his current situation. He is in my tier 2B. And then next up, I have Elic Ayomanor, 6'2", 210 pounds, and according to Wikipedia, he was born circa 2003. So he is an early declare, so I don't know exactly how old he is. And the big reason that he didn't get the hype right away is that aside from just going to Stanford, which isn't the most hyped football program, he was injured for the 2022 season. And I actually think he had a pretty substantial injury in 2022. Elic Ayomanor in this season is also a good argument for why I don't believe in using FCS stats. Because in the FCS game that Stanford played, not only did Elic Ayomanor barely play in that game and barely produce in that game, but it was the only game that Stanford's offense has been very efficient and effective through the air. This was again likely because they didn't need to use Ayomanor, so they load manage Ayomanor, and then they use other parts of the team to blow up against the minor opponent. So in this game, where I don't necessarily consider it like the most competitive situation necessarily, because it is in such a gap of talent level, Elic Ayomanor's proportional numbers that most people use that do include the FCS, they get hit pretty hard here. If you include all of his games, he has 36% of his team's receiving yards and 33% of the touchdowns. But if you just look at the FBS, the receiving percentage in particular goes from 36% to 51%. That 51% is what I'm kind of getting at here. The reason that Elic Ayomanor might not have the best surface stats, but when it comes to all of the production things that I look for, Elic Ayomanor scores the highest. Now, there are certain things about the separation traits for Antonio Williams, for Evan Stewart, that if they were productive, I might prefer them over Ayomanor. But as things currently stand with the production he has, it will be really hard to prefer either one of those two guys to Elic Ayomanor. And it's important to note that while he might not have that kind of separation, I do think he shows the upside to be kind of like a Michael Thomas. Now, that's obviously a very high-end comparison, but he shows that ability to run those curls, those comebacks, those quick slants. Maybe not at the highest level yet, but with a little bit of maturity, with the physicality that he already possesses, I do think he can get there, and he has the strong hands and physical build to be able to handle it. When it comes to some of the information I get from the players themselves, these come from interviews from various sources. And so, it always comes from a questionable source, because while the player themselves obviously knows some things, they're obviously also biased to themselves. But in an interview with PFF, Elic Ayomanor claimed that his 40 time was right around 4.4 flat. So if he does measure in at anywhere close to 6'2", 210 with 4.4 flat and the production at a young age that he has shown, Elic Ayomanor does profile as both a guy who analytically in production and fantasy, as well as in the NFL draft community, could go as high as the late first round. Probably not the early first round still, but maybe the late first round. And to just end on one more quick note about that production, last year in 2023, he had 35.7% of his team's receiving yards and 50% of his team's touchdowns. And those are elite numbers, and they're especially elite numbers for a sophomore. They're elite numbers for anyone for a peak season, 35.7 and 50. I would take that from anybody's peak season any day. It's important to note that some people might hear that and they might think, well, maybe that's all like the Colorado game. Like, how much did the Colorado game really affect that? Because if you don't know, on Friday Night Football last year, Elic Ayomanor had like 300 receiving yards against Colorado. But the answer to that question is, if you just look at after Colorado, his numbers are 36% and 50. So remember, the last two numbers I just said were 35.7% and 50. And basically what this gets at is Elic Ayomanor was not very highly featured in the first few games before Colorado because he was still returning from injury. What Colorado essentially did was set his first half of the season to be at about the pace that he would be for the rest of the year. So in terms of this raw, proportional, statistical type stuff that weighs very heavily into a lot of people's models that they do for wide receiver scouting, Elic Ayomanor actually scores very highly, and that is why he would probably be the top player in this tier if I was picking today. The reason I have a hard time putting him separately from anybody else in this tier is that I do think that Antwane Williams and Evan Stewart have a ton of upward mobility. So the next few guys here, I am a little bit lower than some of the consensus I see thrown around right now. Not necessarily by people who do this from like campus to Canton, but maybe from social media posts, Reddit, from Twitter, these kind of places. And so these are players that I do have like a 3rd round grade on. So not a bad grade by any perspective, but these are players that I do not have a matching grade to many people in the market. So we're going to start with Tre Harris, who would be one of the bigger week 5 risers if we did risers this week. Tre Harris is a 5th-year player, spent the first 3 years of his career at Louisiana Tech. That makes him about 23.5 as of next year. So especially when we're at this point in our ranking, when we're talking about almost exclusively early declares and Emeka Egbuka, that does actually make Tre Harris kind of considerably older than the prospects we've talked about so far. Now, not considerably older than the prospects we're about to talk about, but that is one of the reasons that, especially from this early period where we are still a long way from the draft, that I am preferring these earlier declare players. But Tre Harris, 6'3", 210 pounds. It is worth noting that he's listed at 6'2", 204 by Louisiana Tech. So you wonder if that one is a little bit more accurate and that they blew him up a little bit more when he got to Ole Miss. But in his first 3 FBS games this year, he has 30 receptions, 449 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Most of the games that Ole Miss has played this year, we can really debate the schedule, but Kentucky is a pretty good defense this year. They shut down largely Georgia and limited Ole Miss significantly. But despite his team being limited, Tre Harris had 11 receptions, 225 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So I don't think Tre Harris is really a burner. He's more of a physical wide receiver, and I think that is why he scores a bit lower here and on other people's lists. Now, I'm the last person to really get super archetypal, but just because I don't get super archetypal with my rankings doesn't mean I don't think that they matter at all. And it isn't even the archetype, it is the fact that we talk about separation and point of attack, and Tre Harris, I'm worried, is a little bit too much point of attack. So he is strong in the missed tackles force game, and you can make some pretty lofty comparisons to someone like, say, an Allen Robinson. But right now, even with the spectacular game against Kentucky, I am pumping the brakes on people who are putting Tre Harris near to the first round. Maybe they'll end up being right at the end of the day. Right now, I have him at this early stage at closer to a 3rd round grade. So next up, a guy who has a lot more separation traits, but maybe some flaws in other areas, another 5th-year senior, Xavier Restrepo, the wide receiver from Miami. And if I didn't say it, Tre Harris, Ole Miss. But Xavier Restrepo from Miami, 5'10", 198 pounds, 23 years, 4 months, so right around that same 23.5 with Tre Harris. But I have really 2 questions with Xavier Restrepo, which the number one is that while he was pretty good in his 4th year, 85 receptions, 1,092 yards, 6 touchdowns, we haven't actually seen that take a step forward despite the fact that he got the quarterback upgrade, or the quarterback upgrade on paper, to Cam Ward. While Cam Ward is putting up these huge statistics, all he's really doing for Xavier Restrepo is kind of giving him worse proportional numbers. Because at this point, Xavier Restrepo's proportional numbers are quite a bit worse than what he would have had last year with Miami. But the more specific reason that he is in this 3rd round conversation for me is that we talked about the distinctions earlier, and Xavier Restrepo is at least going to play a lot from the slot. But Xavier Restrepo is the first player that we're really talking about on this list that I have significant concerns is not inside-outside versatile and is actually either slot heavy or slot only. Now, he probably has enough size that he's more slot heavy, but a lot of times what also pushes people to be slot only is the explosive athleticism. So maybe I'm underrating Xavier Restrepo in this way, but Xavier Restrepo is another one of these wide receivers who I see not saying everybody, but sometimes I see in the second, even the first round in mock drafts, though not often on the last one. But for me, Xavier Restrepo is a lot more of a priority day 3 pick and maybe a 3rd round pick, but not as high as he is for other people. So next up, I have a couple of the best performers of the year, starting with Jack Bech, the wide receiver from TCU. And Jack Bech is the wide receiver from a production perspective that is the most impressive in the season. Jack Bech is just a senior in his 4th year, so not a super senior, but I haven't been able to find a date of birth yet. He is 6'2", 215 pounds, so we know he has the size at the very least, even if we don't have any strong indication of testing speed. And in fact, to make one worry about testing speed, he has been listed as a tight end before. But one thing I will say right off the bat is a lot of people say TCU is a cursed school, but Jack Bech went to LSU for the first 2 years of his career. So I would say that counts us out a bit. But he was injured in his 3rd year, which would also be his first year at TCU, and so he wasn't able to produce in that first year. But now in his 2nd year with TCU, he is another one of these cases of a player who was very much load managed in the FCS. Against the FCS, his numbers were much worse than the rest of the competition that he faced. And in these far more close games against far better competition, Jack Bech is 6 for 139 and a touchdown, 9 for 200 and a touchdown, 8 for 166 and 2 touchdowns, and 10 for 131 and 2 touchdowns. So in total, in 4 FBS games, Jack Bech has 33 receptions, 636 yards, and 6 touchdowns. That is an average of over 8 receptions, 159 yards, and 1.5 touchdowns per game. So again, I don't know if Jack Bech is a guy that I'm flying up my rankings necessarily, as much as production is important to me, but as a 4th year player having this level of breakout, he is at least with his size in the day 3 conversation, entering the round 3 conversation, and we will see if he can be a player to rise further than that if he continues to keep it up, or with athletic testing, if he is a better testing athlete than I'm giving him credit for right now. Now, to transition into my next wide receiver, Tai Felton of Maryland, this is kind of a negative to start out with Tai Felton, but, over the past weekend, before this last game with Kentucky, I was talking to someone about Tre Harris' schedule. And I compared Tre Harris' schedule by FPI and Action Network power ranking to teams that Tai Felton and Jack Bech had produced against. And while these numbers aren't the best numbers, obviously we would prefer something about like their secondary specifically. They are significant, especially in the giant tiers of where these different tiers of college teams are. And one thing I noticed just doing that I didn't expect to notice was that TCU's schedule has been sneaky difficult, which kind of made me like Jack Bech a little bit more. But Maryland has had a quietly soft schedule to start the season, and in his first legitimate game against a now top 25 Indiana team, Tai Felton did have by far his worst performance of the season. Now, he did leave with injury early in the game, and he was 5 for 5 on his targets early in the game. But he only broke 1 missed tackle forced, and he was under 2 yards per route run, at least in the plays he had. So that's a very small sample, but especially when Tai Felton's profile is based on this really recent breakout of really a string of very, very productive games, similar to the one we just talked about with Jack Bech. Any kind of slowing down when it's against a harder competition is something that we have to take very seriously. I said on the previous show about, on one of the Riser shows about Felton, that we don't necessarily need him to have like 150 against Ohio State. Like that shouldn't be our expectation, but maybe a little bit better than the Indiana game, maybe breaking a couple more tackles than he did against the Indiana game, and maybe that being against, Ohio State and Michigan, not Indiana. Indiana, better team, but when it comes to the NFL prospects, I'm still going to expect you to drop like 100 yards on Indiana. That's just the way it is. So Tai Felton, going to have a lot of opportunities. USC, October 19th. They have at Oregon. They have Iowa. They had at Penn State. They have Rutgers. I don't actually know if they played Michigan and Ohio State this year. I mentioned Michigan and Ohio State, but I don't actually see them on the opponents I wrote out. But either way, whether we're talking about Michigan and Ohio State, whether we're talking about Oregon and Penn State, these are just the teams that we want to see Tai Felton produce against. So those are the players that I'm at least closer to in the round 3 perspective, and all of these players aren't too far off, but we're starting to slip into more of the clear priority day 3, maybe some players with some upward mobility, but as of today, as of right now, I would consider them more priority day 3. And so we're going to start with a player who actually is rising quite a bit as well, would have been a week 5 riser in his own respect, Dane Key, the wide receiver from Kentucky, 6'3", 210 pounds, 22 years, 2 months old, and Dane Key had a really good freshman season, but he really struggled in his second year to build on that freshman season. The reason I mention him as a potential week 5 riser is in the last 2 games, he has 15 receptions, 250 yards, and 1 touchdown. Now, one of those games was against Ohio, but he did have a good game against Ole Miss as well. And Ole Miss is a team that, at least so far, has been getting respect for having a very good secondary. His game against Ole Miss, 8 receptions, 105 yards, and a touchdown. So, after the good freshman year coming back, on the proportions so far this season, Dane Key has 43.3% of his team's receiving yards. So even though the overall numbers might not stick out that much, the receiving yard proportion, as well as the 25% touchdowns, those are very solid numbers. It is worth noting that he didn't produce very well against Georgia, and he produced extremely well against Ohio and Southern Miss, so it kind of balances out a little bit, but the fact is that he had a 3.18 yards per route run against Ole Miss, so that's a very significant thing to note there. And finally, for a possession wide receiver, Dane Key's drops in the 2023 season were frankly out of character. Now, he is young, so maybe we don't have enough to establish his character, but so far throughout his career, he has had 1 drop in his first 55 targets as a freshman, and then he had 6 drops in the next 68 targets as a sophomore. So that's going from 1 drop in 55 to 6 drops in 68. And then so far in this season, he has 0 drops in 38 targets. So if you look at just his freshman year and just this year, he has 1 drop in 93 targets. In his middle year, he had 6 drops in 68. So I don't know if there was something going on there. I don't know if it's something with the quarterback. I don't know if it's something with his gloves for all I know. But I do know that Dane Key has been a much better possession wide receiver in his first year and his third year than in his second year. And then I would have Dane Key ranked a little bit higher at this point, but especially because he's coming off a good game, it felt like it was a good time here to mention his teammate, Dane Key's teammate, Barion Brown, the wide receiver from Kentucky. Barion Brown is a bit younger than Dane Key, and from a pure raw physicality perspective, he is the player that we would associate with having higher upside. Barion Brown is ultra explosive, and even if he doesn't pan out as a receiver, he is probably a kick returner or punt returner in the future. The biggest problem with Barion Brown, though, is that he went from a very solid freshman year of 50 receptions, 628 yards, and 4 touchdowns, to a sophomore year that was 539 yards, went down about 100, and had a lot more problems. On top of it, this year he's even had a game where he had 0 catches for 0 yards, and 4 of his 5 games this year, he has not broken through 35 receiving yards in his third year. This year, his pace is down another 70 yards, so his pace this season is only 463 yards based on the amount of games he's played the last 2 seasons. And going back to the beginning of 2023, he only has 4 total games at 50 yards. So the 5-88 he had this past weekend against Ole Miss was the best game he's had in a year, the best game in the regular season, at least, that he's had in a year. But Barion Brown is still a very explosive player who will stick around and probably be drafted higher than his profile suggests because of both his explosive upside as a receiver, but also the fact that he probably does bring special teams value. And so next up, I have a couple players who had a ton of spring buzz this offseason, but haven't necessarily lived up to that billing yet, but they're still on my day 3 watch list because they had a ton of buzz and at least have done something. But the first one here is going to be Deion Burks, the wide receiver from Oklahoma, transferred from Purdue, 5'9", 194, 4th-year player, spent again his first 3 years at Purdue. But Deion Burks was really the talk of the offseason. Everyone was talking about his performances in the spring game, about how he would be the number 1 for the team. And obviously Jackson Arnold, the quarterback from Oklahoma, was kind of a flameout this year. And in the very first game where the backup quarterback started, Deion Burks was one of the top 3 wide receivers on Oklahoma's team that was out due to injury. So we really don't know how he's going to play with Hankins yet. But if Deion Burks starts producing with Hankins and with the little bit of production he's already had, you know, the 3 touchdown game in the first week of the season, a couple of the explosive plays we've seen, Deion Burks could still rise into that day 2 conversation. Right now, he is kind of falling on that hype. And then a similar situation here, Kyren Lacy, the wide receiver from LSU, had a lot of offseason hype as the guy who would replace Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. But while the numbers have actually been better for Kyren Lacy, I've probably been less impressed with him so far. Now some of the traits that we've seen on film have been solid. He has shown some good possession ability, but the reason I would say that his statistics are kind of so overrated is because he had his best game in the season in weeks 1 and this most recent week. But in week 1, he had like all of that production in the first half. He had almost all of his production in the first half, and then when the game got really close and LSU ultimately lost the game, he was pretty much absent in the second half. Now, I don't know what too much to make of that, because if we're translating that to the NFL level, we don't need a guy who is going to be consistently great to be significant for fantasy, and a guy who at least can win for like half a game, that's going to be valuable. But the problem is that that wasn't like the end of his disappearance. And he really disappeared until the end of the South Alabama game. He broke 100 yards for the first time of the season against South Alabama, but he had 66 yards in a single drive when they were already up 35-10. So Kyren Lacy really padded his stats at the end of the South Alabama game. So the very first half he played this season and the very last half he played this season have been very productive. Everything else in the middle of that so far this season have been very disappointing. And so there are some traits that we can look into with the size, but to just end on, I don't love to end on negative notes on players, but if the reported age is correct on Kyren Lacy is the oldest player I am talking about today that at least I have a confirmed age for, even older than the two players I'm about to bring up at 24 years, 8 months. So on that note, the reason I'm ending with these players, Kyren Lacy and these next two guys I'm going to get to, Juice Wells and Nick Nash, is that when we are looking from the perspective of these profile things that we're talking about when it comes to production, early production, proportional production, well, some of these things can change. When we're profiling this part far out, it is hard to rank the 24-year-olds at the top of the class. So I would have thought before this that Juice Wells would have been my oldest wide receiver if I would have even included him, but Juice Wells is a 6th-year player from Ole Miss, and he has had quite the journey. Juice Wells spent his first year, I believe it was his first year, it might have been his senior year of high school, but I believe it was one postgraduate year at Fork Union Military Academy. And then he spent 2 years at James Madison, 2 years at South Carolina, and now transfers to Ole Miss. His first year at South Carolina was really, really impressive, and he showed some great explosive ball carrier burst that is more like the kind of traits that we talk about at running back. He showed the ability to just explode in the open field in a way that is very rare and translates to the next level. The problem is, in his 5th year, he had a foot injury and sat out for most of the year with South Carolina and decided instead to also preserve a year of eligibility so he could take another NIL check from Ole Miss. So far this season, Juice Wells has done really nothing that should keep him on this list, but I do see him on other people's lists, and he is a player that I've liked before for the yakability. I frankly took him off certain lists because I didn't think he would come up again after the 24.5 and all that stuff. But since he is still getting a little bit of NFL buzz, and because I do think he could be kind of like a bigger Malachi Corley. Now, Malachi Corley and players like that often don't have success at the NFL level, but a bigger version of a player like that. But right now, with the age, with him not producing this year, he is seeming like a player who probably shouldn't be on a list like this for very much longer, unless he starts to turn it around. Now, the last player we're going to talk about today in this Priority Day 3 conversation, I do have a couple honorable mentions, we're just not going to talk about them very much, but that would be Nick Nash, the wide receiver from San Jose State, another position change player that we have on the list between the multiple positions we're covering. Nick Nash, 6'3", 195 pounds, and he's either 24 years, 2 months or 25 years, 2 months. And by the way, I mentioned one of those for Harold Fannin Jr. I come to those distinctions because when I can't find a birthday, I usually just try to see if I can find it on Twitter. And every now and then I will find a tweet that is wishing a specific person a happy birthday, a specific number birthday on a specific day. And generally speaking, I have found that to be a successful way to find date of birth for some of these players. So both Nick Nash and Harold Fannin Jr. had tweets from their schools that wished them a happy birthday, but neither one gave me their age. So I know what Nick Nash's birthday is. I do not know what year he was born in. So that means he's either 24 years, 2 months or 25 years, 2 months. Those are the two most likely based on when he graduated high school. But anyway, when he entered the transfer portal, he ended up going back to San Jose State. But when he entered the transfer portal this offseason, 247 Sports did give him a 4-star transfer portal grade, which does align with some NFL traits. Or at least that is what I have been taking it to align with in this new transfer portal era. That seems what makes sense to me based on the caliber of player that get that grade. And we also see that in the fact that he is 6'3". Now, the one thing I will say about his production so far, and I haven't even mentioned the production, Nick Nash in 3 games has 40 receptions, 467 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So in 3 games against the FBS, he's averaging 150 yards and 2 touchdowns per game. But the negative in that production is that for being a 6'3" wide receiver, you would expect him to be an outside wide receiver. Nick Nash is playing almost exclusively from the slot. So maybe Nick Nash is this kind of weird, like former quarterback, high IQ, slot player who has a much bigger catch radius than most players who fit that bill. And maybe he can really work as that big slot at the next level. Right now, especially between the age and being a kind of peculiar NFL fit, Nick Nash is definitely a player that I have in my day 3 list. But he is one of the best graded wide receivers in college football right now, and so that is just worth monitoring and mentioning for Nick Nash, the 6th-year player out of San Jose State. So finally, I don't want to go too far into some of these honorable mentions. There are a couple that I am even considering right now in terms of like, should they be on this list? The first one is maybe the best wide receiver in the group of 5 conferences, and that is Ricky White, the wide receiver from UNLV. This is something that I don't expect most people who follow this podcast to have followed much, but UNLV has had some quarterback controversy. The quarterback recently left the program. But despite him being the starter, Ricky White seemed to be the happiest player about that because he wasn't being used very often. And in the first game after that quarterback left, Ricky White had a huge explosive game. So Ricky White actually would be another player who would be on my week 5 risers this week because of that explosive game, because of the fact that he's also coming with a new quarterback that shows us some signs of life. And then another wide receiver that might have made the week 5 risers, that's kind of a slightly lower tier than some of the other guys we've talked about, like say Tre Harris, who would be a pretty big week 5 riser. Elijah Surratt, the wide receiver from Indiana, was a player coming into the season that we had on a watch list. But Surratt didn't really do much for the first few weeks, so we haven't really talked about him much, and he didn't end up being ranked on this list. But Surratt did have a very good game this past weekend. He does have some very good size, and so he is a player to keep an eye on. I also do want to highlight Xavier Henderson from Cincinnati. This was a player that got on some of my watch lists last year as a potential late breakout. He did not do anything with Cincinnati last year, but he is putting up some very, very impressive numbers this year. So for another one of these candidates for a older player but has some physical traits, Xavier Henderson is a player who could easily play himself not just into day 3, but above day 3. I also have 2 wide receivers from both Iowa State and Illinois in Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel from Iowa State and Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin from Illinois. So I don't want to go over all these guys. Pat Bryant and Jaden Higgins are your bigger wide receivers. Jalen Noel and Zachary Franklin are your faster separator wide receivers. But all 4 have flashed for their teams this year, and they're on this list for a reason, but there's not specific enough reasons to go into them individually, just a couple more names to keep an eye on. And then this last name really probably shouldn't be on this list at this point, but given the fact that he's had a lot of popularity in the past, I am still going to have Torrey Horton, the wide receiver from Colorado State, on this list. If you haven't been paying attention to the season, the reason I say that he probably shouldn't be on this list anymore is for a Mountain West Conference wide receiver, who is also an older wide receiver, he really doesn't have much production this year. Now, I know these things sometimes ebb and flow, but it is just kind of hard to see that and project very highly at the next level. So maybe from what we've seen, he should already be in that tier 3 still. But right now, I actually have Torrey Horton kind of closer to the bottom of the mentions. But that is all I have for the wide receiver mentions. That is all I have for the wide receiver position. And that is all I have for the post week 5 rankings. And that concludes this segment from the Fantasy For Real podcast. The full episode can be found in the description or by going to the podcast feed, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you liked the video today, hit the like button, and other than that, I will see you next time.